A black doctor, fresh from saving lives at an international medical conference, steps into the airport ready to return home. But the moment he reaches the security checkpoint, everything shifts. A TSA agent pulls him aside. No explanation. No eye contact, while passengers behind him breeze through. His credentials are questioned, his belongings searched, and his presence treated like a mistake. 7 minutes later, the head of security walks over, ready to defuse the situation. What happened next left the entire checkpoint silent. And triggered a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Because sometimes, the hardest place to stand is the one you've already earned. The hum of the engines was steady. Constant. The kind of sound you only noticed when there was nothing else left to hear. Dr. Adrian Carter leaned back in his seat, stretching his long legs under the polished mahogany table that separated him from the aisle. Across from him, his wife, Dr. Camille Carter, flipped through the neatly organized slides on her tablet. The soft glow from the screen illuminated her face, highlighting the slight crease between her brows. Adrian knew that look. Camille wasn't just reviewing her presentation. She was rehearsing the questions the audience might ask. Anticipating the skepticism that often shadowed her in rooms filled with colleagues who didn't look like her. "You're not giving them an inch this time, huh?" Adrian asked, his voice low and warm, the way it always was when it was just the two of them. She didn't look up, but the corner of her mouth lifted. "I've learned not to." "Have you finished reading your notes? Or are you just people watching?" "Bit of both," Adrian admitted. "You know me." His gaze drifted across the cabin. First class was half full, businessmen tapping away on sleek laptops. A silver-haired couple quietly chatting in the row ahead. A flight attendant drifted between the aisles, her steps practiced and soundless as she offered pre-flight champagne. No one stared at them. Not openly, but Adrian felt it, that subtle stiffness in the air. The way someone's eyes might linger a moment longer than necessary before quickly looking away. It wasn't new. The Carters were used to navigating spaces like this, where the assumption of belonging wasn't freely given but cautiously granted. "Window or aisle?" Adrian asked, already knowing her answer. "Aisle." Camille slid her bag beneath the seat. Careful and deliberate. "I like the option to leave if I need to." Adrian chuckled, shaking his head. "Always ready to escape." "Not escape," she corrected, though her voice softened. "Just ready." The flight had barely begun boarding when it happened. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No outright refusal. "Excuse me," the flight attendant said, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Her smile, polite and perfunctory, didn't quite reach her eyes. "I need to verify your seat assignments." Camille glanced at Adrian, then calmly retrieved her boarding pass from the pocket of her blazer. "Here you go," she said, offering it without hesitation. The attendant studied it for longer than necessary, her eyes flickering between the pass and the two of them. "There's been a slight change," she began, lowering her voice, though there was no need to whisper. "We have a family with small children who were promised an upgrade. Would you be willing to move to the economy? We'd refund the difference, of course." Adrian's fingers tightened slightly around the armrest. He heard the words, but more than that, he felt the weight behind them. The unspoken expectation that this request would make perfect sense. That they would understand, and quietly accept. Adrian set down his book with careful, deliberate slowness. "We purchased these seats months ago. We're comfortable right where we are." The attendant blinked. Her polite smile thinned but held. "I understand, sir. But we're trying to accommodate everyone." Her gaze flicked to the side, and Adrian followed it. A middle-aged couple stood a few feet away, the woman shifting impatiently while the man checked his watch. Their eyes met briefly, and Adrian caught the faintest trace of annoyance in the woman's expression. Camille, who had remained silent until now, tapped gently on her tablet. "I have our confirmation right here," she said, scrolling through the reservation details. "First class. Booked 12 weeks ago." The attendant hesitated, but something in Camille's tone. The quiet authority, the absolute certainty, left little room for negotiation. I'll check with my supervisor, the attendant finally said, offering a tight nod before retreating down the aisle. Adrian exhaled slowly. Here we go again, he muttered. Camille's eyes stayed on the screen, but he saw the flicker of weariness cross her face. It's always something, isn't it? Adrian leaned closer, lowering his voice. We could have walked in wearing scrubs and surgical caps, and they still would have found a reason to ask. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I know. The thing about moments like this was that they lingered. Even after they passed, the businessman across the aisle, who had barely spared them a glance before, was now watching with thinly veiled curiosity. The couple 2 rows ahead had stopped chatting, their heads subtly turned in their direction. It wasn't a confrontation. It was something quieter, something harder to name but just as exhausting. Do you think they'll ask the couple in 2A to switch? Camille asked, nodding toward the older, white couple near the front of the cabin. Adrian didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. The answer hung there between them, as clear and heavy as the air they breathed. No, they wouldn't. And that, more than the request itself, was the heart of it. I don't mind being asked, Adrian said quietly. I mind that they never seem to ask anyone else. Camille's hand found his, squeezing gently. That's because we make them uncomfortable, Adrian. We always have. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. Funny. I thought saving lives would make people comfortable. It should, she said softly, but sometimes the hardest seat to hold is the one you've already earned. Time moves differently when you're waiting to be justified. The flight attendant disappeared down the aisle, leaving Adrian and Camille in the silence that follows after a door has been left slightly ajar. No one said anything. Not out loud. But Adrian could feel the weight of unsaid things hanging in the air like stale perfume. Camille continued flipping through her notes. But Adrian knew she wasn't reading anymore. He wasn't either. His eyes drifted lazily across the cabin. But beneath that casual gaze, his mind was sharp, cutting through the layers of politeness wrapped around this moment. He'd seen this play before. It wasn't about seats. Not really. It was about the assumptions that hovered, like smoke that never quite cleared. A black couple in first class, dressed not in the armor of stethoscopes and white coats but in the soft comforts of cashmere and quiet confidence, somehow disrupted the natural order. They weren't supposed to fit there. The man across the aisle, balding, with a paunch that stretched the seams of his blazer, pretended to read the Wall Street Journal. But Adrian caught the flick of his eyes, the subtle shift as if he were waiting for something to happen. And in a way, Adrian supposed he was. The flight supervisor arrived 10 minutes later. His name tag read T. Daniels. And everything about him, from the stiff collar of his uniform to the practiced smile that barely creased his face, spoke of authority that came easy and unchallenged. Good evening, Dr. Carter. Dr. Carter. He said their titles as if he were reciting a distant fact. Like the weather report for another city. I understand there's been some confusion about your seating. Adrian could feel Camille's breathing slow, controlled and deliberate. She looked up with that same calm she wore in the operating room. The calm of someone who'd been here before and had no patience for unnecessary incisions. There's no confusion, she replied smoothly, holding his gaze. We booked these seats months ago. There's nothing else to discuss. Daniels shifted slightly, just enough to block the aisle. It wasn't intentional, Adrian thought. But that was the thing about men like Daniels. They didn't have to be intentional for the message to land. I see that, ma'am, Daniels said, his tone polite but weighted with something heavier. But we do have a family with small children that was promised an upgrade. I thought perhaps you might be willing to. To what? Adrian interrupted, his voice cutting through Daniels' carefully rehearsed script. Surrender seats we already paid for? Daniels' mouth opened, but Adrian wasn't finished. Let me ask you something, Mr. Daniels, Adrian continued, his tone deceptively light. Did you ask the gentleman in 2A to move? Or the couple in 3B? Daniels hesitated, just for a second. And there it was. Camille's eyes flicked toward Adrian. But she didn't stop him. She knew better. There were moments to let things slide. But this wasn't one of them. Daniels cleared his throat. I was under the impression that. Impressions. Adrian echoed. That's an interesting word. I imagine impressions are what led you here in the first place. He didn't raise his voice. He never did, but the entire cabin seemed to grow quieter, as if the air itself was leaning in to listen. Daniels shifted again, but this time it wasn't just the aisle he was blocking. It was the truth pressing in behind him. Sir, Daniels began carefully, I'm sure we can find a solution that benefits everyone. We already have a solution, Camille said evenly, locking eyes with him. We stay in our seats. The family can wait for the next flight. That seems fair, don't you think? There's a certain kind of quiet that follows after you've said something no one expected you to say. Daniels didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced toward the front of the cabin, where the family, white, well-dressed, waiting with the impatience of people accustomed to getting what they ask for, stood watching the exchange unfold like spectators at a theater they didn't quite understand. The woman, with pearls that gleamed under the soft cabin lights, shifted uncomfortably. Her husband's hand rested gently on her arm. But the message was clear. Let's not make a scene. Daniels must have heard it too because he straightened, his practiced smile tightening at the edges. I'll review the arrangements again, Daniels said finally, stepping back. Thank you for your cooperation. Camille nodded once. The way you acknowledge someone when the conversation is over. As Daniels walked away, Adrian leaned back in his seat, stretching his legs once more beneath the table. You handled that well, Camille murmured, her eyes returning to her tablet. Adrian smirked. I've had practice. But beneath the humor, there was something else, something heavier. Because Daniels would be back. If not him, then someone else. There was always someone else. And Adrian knew this wasn't the end of it. Not yet. The thing about waiting is that it never really feels like waiting. It feels like something pressing against you. A hand just heavy enough on your shoulder to remind you it's there. But not heavy enough for you to shove it off. Adrian watched the flight attendant disappear behind the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. Daniels was still somewhere in the galley, reviewing seat assignments or, more likely, reviewing his reflection in the glass. Practicing the next round of polite refusal. Camille's eyes flickered up from her tablet, locking with Adrian's for just a second. She didn't need to say anything. The look was enough. Here we go again. The first interruption was subtle. A flicker of movement from the man across the aisle, Wall Street Journal still in hand. But now held at that slight tilt people use when they want to pretend they're not eavesdropping. Adrian felt the shift in the cabin like a draft from an open window. It wasn't loud. No one spoke above a murmur. But he saw the sideways glances. The quick, darting looks exchanged by passengers who had, moments ago, been perfectly content to ignore the world around them. Camille turned a page on her tablet. The soft swipe of her finger against the glass almost too loud in the silence that followed. Still nothing, she said quietly, not bothering to look at him. They'll be back, Adrian replied. They always come back. He wished he could say it with more humor. Minutes passed. 5, maybe 10. Long enough for the initial discomfort to settle into something more permanent. Long enough for Adrian to start reading again, though he never really turned the page. And then Daniels returned. This time, his shoulders were a little straighter, the polite mask slipping just slightly at the edges. Dr. Carter, Daniels began, his voice low enough to seem considerate, loud enough to be overheard. I appreciate your patience, but I must insist we discuss your seating arrangement further. Camille set down her tablet carefully, folding her hands in her lap. What exactly needs to be discussed? Mr. Daniels? Daniels' eyes flicked to the side, toward the family still standing near the curtain. The wife cradling a small child. The husband holding a ticket that looked more like a demand than a request. I understand your position, Daniels said, but this family was promised an upgrade. We're simply asking for cooperation. Camille's voice, when it came, was soft, too soft. And what are we being asked to cooperate with? Exactly? Daniels hesitated, just for a second. With the needs of another passenger. He replied. Adrian felt the heat rise behind his ribs. It was always like this. They were never asked to move. Not really. They were asked to cooperate. Asked to understand. It was subtle, this reshuffling of language. A quiet reminder that their presence, asterisk their success, asterisk was conditional. The seats belonged to them. Yes. But only as long as no one else wanted them more. Adrian leaned forward slightly, his voice even. Mr. Daniels, let me ask you something. If my wife and I were a white couple, would we still be having this conversation? The cabin went still. Daniels blinked. Because, Adrian continued, never raising his voice, there are plenty of other passengers here who haven't been asked to give up their seats. But for some reason, you're standing in front of us. Again, Daniels shifted, his collar suddenly too tight, his authority curling in on itself like paper near an open flame. It's not about race, Daniels said quickly, though too quickly. I'm simply trying to ensure the comfort of all passengers. And you decided our comfort was the first thing that had to go. Camille replied, her voice low but sharp. Adrian saw Daniels falter, the way men like him always falter when faced with truths they weren't ready to hold. We're not moving, Adrian said finally, folding his arms across his chest. Daniels opened his mouth. But then she stood up. The young woman was seated 2 rows ahead. She rose quietly, almost hesitantly, a tablet clutched in her hand. Her hair, tied back loosely, slipped over her shoulder as she turned toward Camille and Adrian. Excuse me, she said softly, are you Dr. Camille Carter? The cardiovascular surgeon? Camille's brows lifted slightly. Yes, she replied, with the kind of calm that only comes from years of not being surprised anymore. The young woman's eyes brightened with recognition. She turned the tables around, revealing a medical journal article. Camille's photo stared back at her, poised next to a bold headline about a groundbreaking heart valve replacement technique. I've been studying your work. The young woman stammered, shifting awkwardly under the weight of attention. I'm a cardiology fellow at Johns Hopkins. I didn't realize you were on this flight. Adrian caught the way Daniels froze, his expression flickering between irritation and unease. You've inspired a lot of us. The young woman continued, smiling nervously at Camille. I was hoping to hear your keynote speech at the conference in Geneva. Camille's expression softened. Thank you. I appreciate that. Adrian could see it now. The way Daniel's shoulders sank just slightly, the stiffness in his posture unraveling thread by thread. Because there was nothing left to argue. The young doctor wasn't loud. She wasn't confrontational. But her recognition did something no amount of insistence ever could. It made Daniels feel small. By the time Daniels stepped back, the quiet hum of the cabin had shifted. It wasn't just politeness anymore. It was something closer to respect. Adrian watched Daniels retreat, the man's carefully constructed authority cracking at the edges as he murmured something about reviewing arrangements. Camille smiled faintly, returning to her notes as if the interruption had never happened. You know, Adrian said quietly, leaning closer, I almost feel sorry for him. Camille's eyes flicked to his, humor dancing faintly behind them. Don't, she said, her voice just loud enough for only him to hear. He'll survive the inconvenience. The curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane didn't seem like much. A thin sheet of fabric, barely thick enough to mute the murmurs drifting in from economy. And yet, Adrian Carter had always known that curtain wasn't really made of fabric. It was made of something heavier, expectation. Expectation that some people belonged on one side and others belonged elsewhere. He watched as Daniels disappeared behind it, leaving behind the lingering scent of his discomfort. The family, still huddled by the bulkhead, had settled into waiting. The wife shifted from foot to foot, her pearls glinting under the cabin lights, while the husband's fingers danced over his phone. Camille hadn't moved. Her posture was regal, her eyes skimming the data on her screen with the precision of a surgeon. But Adrian knew her well enough to see the tension simmering beneath it. This wasn't over. It never was. The thing about moments like this is that they don't dissolve. They sit there, suspended, waiting for the next shift. Adrian didn't have to wait long. A second flight attendant, younger and more timid than the first, appeared in their row. She didn't carry the same air of authority Daniels did. Her eyes skated nervously between Adrian and Camille as if she'd drawn the short straw. Excuse me, she began softly, her voice fluttering like a leaf caught in a draft. Mr. Daniels has asked me to. Adrian raised a hand, cutting her off with a gentleness that still carried weight. I know what he asked. He said, but let me save you some time. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, though not so low that the people around them couldn't hear. My wife and I have spent most of our careers in rooms where we weren't expected. Being questioned by people who assumed we were lost. This isn't new for us. The flight attendant's eyes flickered with unease. But Adrian wasn't finished. And let me tell you what's going to happen. We're going to stay right here. In these seats we paid for. And you're going to let that family wait. Because Mr. Daniels made promises he had no business making. The young woman swallowed, nodding quickly. I understand. But understanding wasn't the point. Adrian didn't need her understanding. He needed her to know that he understood. When she left, Camille finally glanced over at him. One brow arched in that way that said you could have let her finish. She's just doing her job, Camille said, though her voice lacked conviction. Her job is to serve drinks. Adrian replied, not to play the middleman for someone else's cowardice. Camille sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. It's exhausting, she admitted softly, knowing we can't even sit on a plane without defending why we're here. Adrian's eyes softened. I know, he said, threading his fingers through hers beneath the table. But this is part of it. Camille, you know that. She did. She'd known it since medical school. Since the first time a patient mistook her for a nurse or asked to see the real doctor. The plane hadn't even taken off yet. But the weight pressing down on their shoulders felt heavier than any luggage in the overhead bins. Camille returned to her reading. But Adrian could still feel the ripple of attention moving through the cabin. People weren't watching openly. No. They were far too polite for that. But the eyes were there. Hidden behind newspapers, flickering over the tops of magazines, peeking from between the slats of lowered window shades. The older man across the aisle. The one who hadn't spoken but had been watching cleared his throat lightly. Excuse me, he said, leaning in just slightly. I couldn't help but overhear. Adrian raised his eyes slowly. Could you? The man smiled faintly, though there was something apologetic about it. I imagine you deal with things like this often. Adrian held his gaze for a beat too long, letting the weight of the question settle between them. More often than you'd think, Adrian replied. The man nodded thoughtfully. Well, he said, straightening in his seat, I just wanted to say, it's impressive how you handled it. Adrian didn't smile. He didn't want to be impressive. He wanted to be left alone. But he nodded politely, knowing that sometimes white comfort required more effort than it was worth to deny. Minutes passed. The cabin settled into a forced kind of stillness. And then Daniels returned. His steps were slower this time. More measured. The polished confidence that had carried him before was dulled. Chipped at the edges. Dr. Carter, Daniels began, his hands clasped in front of him like a man approaching a verdict he didn't want to deliver. I've spoken with my supervisor. And we've decided to honor your seating arrangement. Camille's lips pressed into a thin line. You've decided? Daniel's eyes flickered toward her, realizing too late the mistake. Of course, he corrected quickly. I mean, it was never our intention to cause discomfort. Camille's stare didn't waver. Discomfort isn't the issue, Mr. Daniels, she replied smoothly. The issue is that you didn't think we belonged here in the first place. Daniels shifted, clearly searching for the nearest exit in a conversation that had no safe escape. Please let us know if there's anything else we can do to make your flight more comfortable. He added hurriedly, nodding once before retreating. Adrian watched him leave, the tension slowly leaking from the cabin like air from a pin-pricked balloon. But the weight never really left. Camille exhaled softly, leaning back in her seat. One day, she murmured, we'll walk into these spaces without feeling like intruders. Adrian gave her hand a squeeze. Maybe, he said, but if we can't, we'll make sure the next generation doesn't have to. And with that, Camille returned to her work, letting the hum of the engines drown out everything else. But Adrian? He kept his eyes on that curtain. Because some lines, asterisk no matter how invisible, asterisk always felt just close enough to trip over. The plane had finally lifted off. But Adrian Carter knew this wasn't over. High above the clouds, with nothing but soft cabin lights and the hum of jet engines. The air in first class felt thicker than it should. The kind of thick you don't notice unless you've spent years learning how to breathe through it. Daniels hadn't returned since his last awkward apology. But absence, Adrian thought, is its own kind of presence. You'd think we were trying to sit on the Pope's lap. Adrian muttered, closing his journal. Camille didn't look up from her tablet. But the faintest smirk touched her lips. That would probably be easier. Less paperwork. He chuckled under his breath. But the truth weighed heavier than the joke. Adrian had seen this play out too many times to count. A soft no disguised as a misunderstanding. A polite redirection that left the insult just vague enough to deny. But it wasn't vague. It was sharp enough to draw blood. Across the aisle, the businessman had put down his newspaper. His laptop glowed faintly, the reflection flickering across his glasses as he tapped at the keys. Every so often, Adrian felt the man's eyes flick toward them. He's looking us up, Camille whispered, barely moving her lips. Adrian nodded. I know. Recognition often came late. First, there was doubt, then curiosity, then the inevitable, oh, it's you. The businessman's brow furrowed as he stared at the screen. His fingers paused mid-air, like he'd found something he hadn't been expecting. Adrian could almost hear the thoughts turning in the man's head. Doctors, surgeons, that can't be right. That can't be them. But it was. And that was the thing about people like Daniels or the man across the aisle. They never considered they might have underestimated the room. Camille's voice was soft but steady. I saw his badge. He works for one of the pharmaceutical firms. Adrian glanced toward the laptop. Which one? GreenTech, she replied. They pitched us last year. Adrian exhaled through his nose. Of course. He remembered the meeting. A room full of executives explaining technology to surgeons as if they hadn't spent their entire lives mastering the craft. Adrian had stopped counting how many times someone called him Marcus by mistake. Even though his name was printed on the folder right in front of them. GreenTech hadn't won their contract. And Adrian doubted that was a coincidence. The man finally spoke. Dr. Carter? Adrian looked over, lifting his brow just slightly. Yes? The businessman smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I thought that was you. I read your paper on minimally invasive valve replacement a few months ago. Impressive work. Adrian nodded, careful not to give too much away. Appreciate that. You know, my mother had that procedure. The man continued, his voice lowering as if trying to bridge a gap he hadn't noticed until now. She's doing great. I didn't realize you were behind it. Adrian held his gaze for a long moment. It wasn't that the man's gratitude wasn't real. It probably was. But Adrian had learned something over the years: gratitude and dismissal could live in the same breath. He'd had patients who thanked him for saving their lives and then asked for another opinion. Colleagues who celebrated his breakthroughs in the boardroom but forgot to invite him to dinner. Camille must have sensed the shift. Because she leaned slightly forward. Her voice as calm as ever. We're glad to hear she's doing well. The procedure's come a long way. But it's still evolving. The businessman nodded, hesitating before adding, I'm surprised they didn't recognize you earlier. Adrian didn't blink. I'm not. The man chuckled awkwardly. But Adrian wasn't laughing. When the businessman returned to his work, Camille met Adrian's eyes with that same quiet understanding they had shared for years. You could have let him have that moment. She teased gently. I know, Adrian replied, but he'll survive the inconvenience. Camille smiled, though the weight beneath it lingered. The hours stretched on, the cabin dimming as the flight settled into the heavy quiet of late-night travel. Adrian tried to rest, but his mind replayed Daniel's face. The tight-lipped smiles, the quiet refusal that left no fingerprints. This wasn't the kind of discrimination that roared. It whispered. It whispered in the lowered eyes of attendants who asked for boarding passes twice. In the tightening of smiles when they approached podiums to speak. In this way the world always seemed to ask, are you sure you belong here? And beneath that whisper was something more dangerous. The expectation that they would let it slide. Camille shifted beside him, tucking a blanket under her arm. Try to get some sleep, she said softly. Adrian leaned back, closing his eyes. But rest didn't come easy. Not at 30,000 feet. And not when the weight of a lifetime sat quietly on your chest. Because the truth of it was this. There are no small slights. Not when you spend your life stepping over the same invisible line. Hoping the next time you cross it, someone won't ask to see your ticket. Adrian Carter had learned a long time ago that silence wasn't empty. It carried weight. It carried memory. And tonight, as the cabin lights dimmed and the rest of the plane drifted into sleep, that silence felt louder than the hum of the engines. He watched Camille's breathing steady beside him. Her tablet finally dark. Her hands folded over it as if to protect something fragile. But Adrian couldn't close his eyes. Because he could feel it. The shift. The kind of shift that happens right before someone reminds you that even if you belong in the room, you weren't necessarily invited. It started with a shadow. Daniels hadn't returned to their row. But Adrian saw him linger by the galley. The curtain rippled slightly as Daniels pulled it back just enough to glance into first class. Adrian caught his eye. There it was again. That soft hesitation. That weighing of options. Daniels wasn't asking anymore, but he hadn't entirely let go either. The seat beside Adrian may as well have been empty. Daniels was still trying to fill it. Adrian turned back to the businessman across the aisle. He was asleep now, mouth slightly open, the Wall Street Journal folded neatly on the armrest. A headline peeked from the corner. Markets shift as industry leaders predict economic downturn. Adrian smiled faintly. Markets weren't the only thing shifting. The curtain whispered again. This time, it wasn't Daniels who emerged but the woman. The mother from the family waiting for the upgrade. She stepped quietly, her heels soft against the carpet, stopping just at the edge of Adrian's row. "Excuse me," she said, almost too gently. "I'm sorry to bother you." Camille stirred slightly but didn't open her eyes. Adrian straightened. "Yes?" The woman smiled nervously, glancing toward the empty seat next to him. The seat Daniels had spent half the flight circling. "My husband and I, well, we've been waiting, and I was just wondering." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Adrian's eyes softened. "You were wondering if we might reconsider moving." The woman's cheeks flushed. "I just thought, since you both seem comfortable, perhaps." Adrian held up a hand gently, cutting through her words the same way he had with Daniels. "I understand," Adrian said softly, his voice carrying the weight of far too many years. "But we paid for these seats. And with all due respect, ma'am, that's the end of it." The woman hesitated, her hands wringing together lightly as if she were holding onto the edges of something delicate. "But we have children," she offered, her voice dipping just enough to suggest that this. Surely, was the trump card. Adrian let the words settle. He glanced over at Camille, her hand now resting on his arm. Awake and listening. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Adrian looked back at the woman. "And my wife and I," he said slowly, "have patience. Lives that depend on the work we're doing at this conference. Those children of yours. One day, they might need surgeons like us." The woman blinked. Adrian smiled faintly. "So you see, we're exactly where we need to be." For a moment, the woman simply stood there, caught between apology and retreat. Then, without another word, she turned and slipped quietly back behind the curtain. Camille exhaled softly beside him. "You handled that well," she said, brushing his arm gently. Adrian chuckled under his breath. "I didn't want to make her feel small." Camille closed her eyes again. She made that decision on her own. Minutes passed. The plane drifted through the night sky. But Adrian stayed awake, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon outside the window. And then, like clockwork, Daniels returned. This time, he didn't stop at their row. He lingered just behind it, speaking softly with Sarah, the flight attendant who had first approached them. Adrian could hear them even if he wasn't meant to. "They're doctors," Sarah was saying. "Surgeons." Actually, Daniel's voice dipped lower, but Adrian caught pieces. "I know, but the family." Sarah cut him off. "They're staying in their seats. Just leave it alone." Adrian glanced toward the curtain just in time to see Daniels finally walk away. And that, Adrian thought, was the difference. Daniels had wanted to win. But Sarah just wanted to be done. The rest of the flight passed in peace. But Adrian knew this wasn't really peace. It was just an intermission. The truth about racism. The kind that didn't shout but whispered. Is that it didn't rest. It simply stepped back and waited for the next opportunity. And Adrian had no doubt it would come. It always did. By the time the plane began its descent into Geneva, the cabin stirred with quiet activity. Camille stretched beside him, gathering her things, while Adrian tucked his journal back into his bag. As they waited for the doors to open, Sarah stopped by their row one last time. I just wanted to say. She began hesitantly. I'm sorry for earlier. I should have handled it better. Camille smiled gently. You handled it the way most people do. Sarah flushed. I hope you both have a great conference. Adrian nodded. But before Sarah could walk away, he added softly, next time, don't let people like Daniels make you question your instincts. Sarah hesitated, holding his gaze for just a moment before nodding and stepping aside. As Adrian and Camille stepped off the plane, Geneva's crisp morning air washed over them. Adrian could hear the faint sounds of the city waking up in the distance. The hum of traffic, and the soft chatter of travelers. But beneath it all, he heard something else. The echo of invisible lines. Lines that stretched far beyond the airport. Lines that crisscrossed through boardrooms, classrooms, hospitals, and homes. And as Adrian looked over at Camille, he squeezed her hand gently, knowing that the most important work they would ever do wasn't just in surgery. It was in holding onto their seats. The terminal was quiet at this hour. The kind of quiet that feels borrowed, something you know won't last long. Adrian Carter walked beside Camille through the sleek, glass corridors of the Geneva airport, their footsteps echoing faintly against polished floors. Behind them, the flight attendant's soft apology still lingered, a delicate reminder of the weight they carried off the plane. They weren't just surgeons. They were witnesses, carrying not just their luggage but the history of every room that had paused a little too long when they entered. At the baggage claim, Camille leaned against the railing, arms crossed lightly over her chest, her eyes following the slow rotation of suitcases. You'd think by now, she murmured, we'd stop being surprised. Adrian glanced at her. You surprised? Camille smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. No, she admitted, just tired. Adrian understood that kind of tiredness. It wasn't exhaustion from the day or even the flight. It was the exhaustion of holding the door open while the world pretended not to see you standing there. A few rows behind them, the businessman from the plane stood with his carry-on, watching discreetly but not discreetly enough. Adrian caught his eye briefly. The man shifted, as if considering whether to approach. Looks like we made a fan. Adrian muttered. Camille followed his gaze and sighed. There's always one. The man hesitated, then crossed the space between them. Dr. Carter, he began, his voice lower than necessary, like someone sharing a secret they weren't sure they were allowed to tell. I just wanted to thank you again. About my mother. What you said on the plane. Adrian nodded, polite but distant. I'm glad to hear she's recovering well. The man glanced at Camille, then back at Adrian. I hope you didn't take Daniels too seriously. Some of these airlines, they just make poor decisions sometimes. I'm sure it wasn't personal. Adrian felt Camille's stillness beside him. There it was, the gentle rewriting, as if Daniel's hands hadn't been on the wheel the whole time. As if that polite noose of suggestion and dismissal hadn't been tightening from the moment Adrian stepped on the plane. The man wasn't apologizing. He was smoothing over, trying to ease a discomfort that was never Adrian's to hold in the first place. Adrian met the man's gaze steadily. It's always personal, he said softly. The businessman blinked. Adrian didn't give him time to finish. My wife and I paid for those seats. The same as anyone else in first class. Daniels wasn't confused about our names or our reservation. The man opened his mouth. But Adrian kept going. The confusion, Adrian added, his voice calm but deliberate, was about why we were there. The man shifted uneasily, his polite mask slipping just slightly. I didn't mean. Adrian held up a hand, cutting the apology before it could land. I know what you meant. Adrian said, but meaning isn't the issue. The issue is who gets the benefit of the doubt. And who doesn't. For a moment, the man just stood there, his hands buried deep in his pockets. Camille, watching the exchange silently, finally spoke. It's a strange thing, she said quietly, to always have to explain your right to be where you are. The businessman shifted again. I guess I never thought about it that way. Camille smiled faintly. That's the point. By the time the man retreated to his corner of the baggage claim, the carousel had started moving. Adrian watched him disappear into the crowd. Camille reached for her suitcase, setting it upright with a soft thud. You could have let him leave feeling good about himself, she teased lightly. Adrian grunted, lifting his own bag. He'll survive the disappointment. Camille chuckled under her breath. You're starting to sound like me. As they stepped out into the cool Geneva morning, Adrian felt the shift in the air. Not just the temperature, but something more subtle. There was something different about being outside the United States. The weight of race and belonging wasn't gone, but it moved differently here. Sometimes it pressed against you. Sometimes it just watched from across the room. But it was always there. Think they'll seat us next to the kitchen at dinner tonight? Adrian asked. Camille glanced at him sideways. Only until they realize we're the keynote speakers. Adrian smiled faintly. Right. And then the chef's table magically opens up. It was a joke, but not really. Because Adrian knew how this worked. You spend your life earning a seat at the table, only to find the table keeps moving. And yet, you sit down anyway. Not because you're waiting to be accepted, but because the table was always yours to begin with. As they hailed a cab and slipped into the backseat, Camille glanced at Adrian, her fingers laced through his. You know, she murmured, watching the city stretch out before them. I think we're exactly where we need to be. Adrian squeezed her hand gently. Yeah, he said softly. We are. The car moved quietly through the streets of Geneva, the early light casting long shadows across buildings too old to pretend at innocence. Adrian Carter watched the city slip by, but his mind was elsewhere, still somewhere between the sky and the ground. Camille sat beside him, her head resting gently against the window. But Adrian knew she wasn't sleeping. There are some things you can't sleep off. Funny thing about airports, Adrian said softly, breaking the silence. Camille's eyes flickered open, her reflection faint against the glass. What's that? They always feel the same, he replied. Doesn't matter if you're in Boston or Geneva. There's always someone waiting to remind you that you're not where you belong. Camille shifted, her gaze lingering on him for a long moment. And yet, she murmured, here we are. Adrian chuckled quietly, shaking his head. Yeah, here we are. But beneath the humor, the truth pressed deeper. Arriving doesn't mean the journey is over. Sometimes, it's just another beginning. The cab pulled to a smooth stop outside their hotel. A grand structure with stone columns that loomed over the sidewalk as if history itself had pressed its weight into the foundation. Adrian stepped out first, holding the door for Camille as she gathered her things. The doorman, an older man with silver at his temples, barely glanced at them before extending his hand toward a white couple stepping out of a car behind them. Adrian watched the interaction, slow and deliberate, noting the difference in tone. The subtle shift from service to reverence. Camille noticed it too. She glanced at Adrian, her voice low enough for only him to hear. Not even inside yet. Adrian smiled faintly. Wouldn't want to break tradition. Inside the lobby, it was the same story. The concierge's eyes flickered to Adrian's suitcase but lingered on the man adjusting his cufflinks at the next desk over. Adrian wasn't invisible. He was out of focus. It wasn't the outright exclusion. The slamming of doors or loud refusals that exhausted him. It was a soft denial. The kind that didn't leave bruises but left something deeper. Camille stepped forward, placing their reservation on the counter. Her posture so still it could have been carved from stone. The concierge finally looked up, clearing his throat. Ah, of course. Dr. and Dr. Carter, he said, fumbling slightly over the second title. Welcome. I wasn't expecting you so soon. Camille smiled. The kind of smile that only half exists. You were expecting someone else? The concierge hesitated, then quickly shook his head. Not at all, ma'am. Let me check you in. As they waited, Adrian felt the weight settle again. Not the luggage at his feet, But something heavier. You know, Camille said softly, glancing around the lobby. I think this might be the first time I've been tired before the conference even started. Adrian exhaled slowly. You'd think we'd stop being surprised. But the truth was, surprise wasn't the problem. The problem was that after all these years, they still had to pretend it surprised them at all. The elevator ride to their floor was quiet, save for the soft hum of motion. As the doors opened, Camille stepped out first, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted hallway. Adrian followed, rolling his suitcase behind him. But his mind lingered on the faces they passed in the lobby. The brief flicker of recognition followed by the decision to look away. That was the part no one talked about. Not the hatred, but the absence. The choice to erase people like him. Not by force, but by simply pretending they were never there in the first place. Later that evening, as the conference hall began to fill, Adrian stood near the stage, scanning the room. He could feel the quiet shift of glances, the way conversations dipped just slightly when he walked by. Camille stood beside him, her arms crossed lightly, taking it all in. You know they're watching, she murmured. Adrian smiled. Let them. Because at the end of the day, this was why they came. Not to prove anything, but to remind the room and themselves that they weren't just guests at this table. They built it. As Camille stepped onto the stage to deliver her keynote, Adrian watched the room settle. Some listened with genuine interest. Others listened because it would have been too obvious not to. But Adrian knew the truth. Even if they didn't want her there, they needed her there. And there was nothing more powerful than that. By the time the conference ended, Adrian and Camille left the hall the same way they entered, quiet, steady, but unshaken. Outside, the city stretched out before them, the air brisk against their skin. Adrian slipped his hand into Camille's as they walked toward the car waiting to take them back to the hotel. She squeezed his hand gently. You know, she said, her voice soft but sure. I think we did more than just hold our seats today. Adrian smiled. Yeah, I think we did too. Because the thing about belonging is this. Sometimes the hardest seat to hold is the one you've already earned.